Alright, so one of the things I'd like to do with my videos on this channel is take some time out and make a second series of shorter videos about essentially my principles and defining certain terms. And so I think the best way to start this off is by saying essentially that if you haven't guessed, this is a political channel, and the first thing I think you should do when you have a political stance, whether it's as a party, as an individual, or as a government as a whole, is have a principle on what you believe the role of government is. So, in my case, I think the role of the government should be first and foremost, if not exclusively, to defend the rights of its citizens. And then you have to go about defining what your rights are. Now, a lot of the rights that I believe that we have are outlined in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution itself. You know, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the freedom of speech, the freedom to defend yourself, and those sorts of things. Two of the other things that a lot of people believe the government is in place to do that I don't necessarily agree with or don't agree with at all is to legislate morality and to provide social services or services of any kind. So, that being said, I wouldn't go as far to say that I'm an ANCAP of any kind, where like oh well, the private citizenry will build roads, and that might be a video. Definitely is a video I'm going to talk about how roads get built with and without a system in place, and the benefits and negatives of each. But I do believe that unless the research I'm doing on the topic has a chance of changing my mind, that I'll stick with the position that yes, roads are things that the government can handle. But nonetheless, to get back to the subject of this video, I think the first and foremost thing the government should be doing is defending our rights. Now, in terms of what does this mean as far as the laws that are out there, you know, I think that we should be treating all of our citizens the same under the law, which is, you know, meritocracy essentially. I also think that the moralistic side, there is a moralistic value to essentially any right that you create, but that the moralistic values, I think, for the most part, come from when you're enacting upon another individual. So, if you have a right to not be murdered, which we do, essentially you have the right to life, then murdering someone, even though it's somewhat of a moral decision whether it's okay to murder someone or not, but being murdered is not okay. So someone who commits murder is therefore not okay. So enforcing a law that prevents murder is acceptable even if it's somewhat moralistic. And I think that's a very fine line that you have to draw, and that's why you have to choose what rights that you have very, very carefully. For example, like wearing a seatbelt, that's a personal decision unless you're like a child or something where you're protected under child endangerment. That would be the sort of thing that is a personal choice, does not affect other people around you, and therefore shouldn't be something the government's involved in. And just to take this example, and I don't think, by the way, that seatbelt laws are the hill to die on. I'm just using it as an example because it seems like a harmless thing, and then when you dig into it, you're like, oh, there's actually a lot to unpack here. When you look at, for example, like a seatbelt law, you know, it's not just a matter of, oh, we'd like it if everyone wore seatbelts, you'd save a lot of lives. I think it's good personally to wear a seatbelt. I always wear my seatbelt. I drove a truck professionally for a long time. Not for a long time, I shouldn't say that. I drove it for a year, which felt like forever because it wasn't the job for me, but I did it. Nonetheless, I wore my seatbelt all the time. I still wear my seatbelt essentially all the time, except for when I drive my motorcycle because they don't have seatbelts. But I don't think that we should have a law compelling you to wear a seatbelt, and it's because of sort of how the ramifications of such laws tend to start to creep. And I don't mean like the slippery slope, well, if you have to wear a seatbelt, then we're going to make another one where you have to have an airbag or something, although that certainly is another regulation that exists for new car manufacturers that maybe shouldn't. But nonetheless, that's not, I don't mean the slippery slope argument, but I mean where we have to be able to enforce that law, which means that you have to either allow people to be pulled over for not wearing a seatbelt, so now you're infringing upon their freedom to move around and do things, you're interrupting their day, If they're at work, you're draining productivity. You're paying that police officer to perform these actions. If something goes wrong, like they pull them over, they think they see a gun, it's actually an airsoft gun, they get shot in the face somehow because they reach for their wallet, which is also under the chair where the handle of the fake gun is. That's ridiculous and almost never happens. So it's sort of like I'm arguing a fringe case, but when you're dealing with like millions of incidents of something, you're going to have these fringe cases. Like it'll eventually happen to someone, and then of course maybe there'll be a big fight about it, even though it'll probably not happen again for years and years. That's another argument to be had. But nonetheless, you have to pay tax dollars to enforce the law. You have to pay judges to hear the cases. You have to pay collectors to collect the fines. Unless you're imprisoning people, then you have to pay for prisoners, and then you have the lost productivity of the people who suffer these sort of penalties for not wearing a seatbelt. And so there's a lot more that goes into the sort of impact on both the lives, freedoms, and expenses of the federal government or local government, whatever government's implementing these laws, that have to be considered. So it's not just a matter of, well, wear your seatbelt. And, you could argue against that, saying, oh, well, but the lost productivity of someone dying is also not good, but a dead person uses significantly fewer tax dollars than an imprisoned person, which maybe isn't a very comfortable realization to come to, but it is if you're trying to compare. If you're drawing the comparison saying, well, you need seatbelt laws because it protects lives, then you are drawing that comparison that it is better that we pay people to go out and enforce these laws, pay people to handle the paperwork, to chase the, you are making that comparison. So in that case, my response is, well, okay, fine. If you want to make the comparison, seatbelts save lives. Well, seatbelts also impact lives a lot more. The law itself, the enforcement of the law, would impact lives a lot more than just, oh, well, your life is saved because you wrecked and you didn't go flying. There is these other things to consider. And when you look at the situation, and you stand back and you're like, on a micro level, it's like, oh, well, this is just silly. It's seatbelts. Like, just wear your seatbelt. It's not a big deal. But when you really step out and you look at just how much something that simple can impact the way the government operates and the cost to taxpayers and the infringement on people who are just wandering, driving around and getting pulled over because the police officers thought they weren't wearing a seatbelt and then it turns out they were, or whatever, just if something that small can affect so many things, it's really, really astounding how much the bigger things can affect people's lives. And so I think it's a great example because it's like, just something you can really unpack and get into, and it's interesting. And I know a lot of people will say, well, but, we should be legislating morality. You shouldn't be allowed to say mean things about gay people or about a race if you're a racist or whatever. Right? But if you're legislating morality, even if it's not religious morality, you're essentially justifying every single religious government theocracy that's ever existed. It's just that the religious theocracy isn't your current morality, but you still think it's okay to legislate from a position of morality. So you're saying that all of those collective groups of people, like the Islamists in the Middle East right now, who are carrying out Sharia courts and throwing gays off roofs and forcing women to wear burqas and, murdering infidels and funding terrorism, that you're essentially saying if it's okay to legislate from a moralistic position because the majority wants it, then all of those countries, because their majorities want it, or at least support it enough that it stays in power, are absolutely justified. And I think that's a absolutely ridiculous position to take. We should be defining our rights and defending our rights and leaving the moralistic decisions to the individual. And I think that's where I'm going to leave this video at.